A queen is born, a world is changed. London sleeps, or at least pretends to. It is the early morning of June 20th, 1837, and something, deep within the city, is about to change forever. The streets are still damp from the rain, the gas lamps flicker through the thick fog, and somewhere inside Kensington Palace, a teenage girl of only 18 receives the news that will transform not only her life, but the fate of an entire empire. Her uncle, King William IV, has died overnight at Windsor, and with his final breath, he has opened the door to a new era. An era that will bear the name of that young woman, still half asleep, pale-cheeked, soft-voiced, and firm of character, Victoria. The scene is small, almost intimate. There are no cheering crowds, no trumpets, no speeches. Just a silent corridor, hurried footsteps, and a letter that confirms everything. But it is precisely in those subtle moments where history is sometimes born, where the ordinary becomes myth. No one knows it yet, not even her. But this quiet dawn in London is lighting the fuse of an entire century, a new one that will break from the past in politics, morality, science, urban life, and spirit. A century that, although it does not yet smell of coal or molten iron, already breathes ambition, transformation, and above all, empire. Victoria was born in 1819 in the very palace where she now wakes as queen. Daughter of Edward, Duke of Kent and fourth son of George III, she was not originally destined for the throne. Only the twists of succession placed her in that line of fire. George III had 15 children, but many died without leaving legitimate heirs. The crown, as capricious as ever, passed from name to name until it landed on her, almost like a joke of fate. And yet, what seemed improbable became inevitable, and the inevitable ended up shaping history. Her childhood was not a happy one. Her father died when she was only 8 months old, and her mother, the Duchess of Kent, of German origin, raised her in a stifling environment, structured by a system of constant surveillance known as the Kensington system. She was not allowed to be alone, to speak without supervision, or to sleep without company. They watched her, isolated her, molded her. And although that reduced world was meant to make her dependent, what it truly forged was a firm will, a quiet conviction that, over the years, would become one of the pillars of the British state. That June 20th was not just a change of reign. It was a symbolic rupture. William IV represented a wavering time, still tied to the echoes of the old regime. Victoria, by contrast, was the promise of the new. She was not a revolutionary woman in the radical sense of the word, but she would become a figure that embodied, like no other, stability amid a world breaking apart and rebuilding at an unprecedented pace. When she was officially crowned a year later, in June of 1838, the atmosphere in London was different. The people looked at her with a mix of hope and skepticism. She was young, yes, but not naive. There was something in her gaze, a kind of subtle firmness, almost inexplicable. In her diary, she wrote that day, "I shall perform my duty with all sincerity and with all my heart." And she did, with more constancy than passion, more discipline than boldness, but with a strength that would become a symbol. Because Victoria, at her core, was not a military empress nor a charismatic leader. She was something more complex, an axis, a point of balance. Around her revolved governments, economic crises, social reforms, scientific advances, and colonial conquests. And although she did not personally direct those forces, her presence contained them. Her figure was used as a banner, a shield, and a mirror of the values that England wanted to believe it represented: order, morality, progress, family, faith, and nation. By 1837, Great Britain was already an industrial power, but not yet a consolidated world empire. The Industrial Revolution was underway, but its consequences were unequal, and often brutal. Cities grew without planning. Factories exploited workers without regulation, and children labored until their voices gave out. There was hunger. There was disease. There was a population multiplying beyond what the social structures could hold. It was, in a way, a world on the edge of an abyss. And there, at that edge, appeared Victoria, not as a savior, but as a persistent witness. One of the most fascinating mysteries of her figure is how, without being an active political leader, she managed to influence the entire sensibility of the century. Through her personal choices, her silences, her customs, she imposed a new morality that filtered into homes, into schools, into books, even into manners. Victorian morality was not just a phrase. It was a way of living, or rather, of appearing to live. A code that rewarded discipline, discretion, family, work. Even when those virtues were not practiced, they had to be faked, and that already made a difference. The Queen's youth coincided with an England in transition. From countryside to city, from coal to machine, from aristocratic parliament to one increasingly reformist. Electoral reforms had begun in 1832, just a few years before her reign. Democracy was still a partial experiment, but it was advancing. The railways were beginning to draw a new geography on the map, connecting regions, shortening distances, multiplying rhythms. And meanwhile, in the colonies, the British shadow expanded through trade agreements and rifles. Victoria did not fully understand the complexity of that world when she ascended the throne. She was too young, too sheltered. But she learned quickly. She surrounded herself with key figures such as Lord Melbourne, who became a kind of political mentor. She learned to listen, to wait, to remain firm in critical moments. And over the years, she perfected an art that only truly long-reigning monarchs master: the art of representing without wearing out, of being a symbol without losing humanity. Her first speech before Parliament was brief, measured, but enough to show that she would not be a puppet. And over time, although she stayed out of major debates, her presence wove an invisible thread through all the changes. When she came to the throne, the telegraph did not exist. When she died, there were telephones, electric trains, photography, and an imperial network that covered a quarter of the planet. And still she remained, at the center, as an almost eternal figure that seemed to defy time. She was not the one who pushed the century forward, but she was the one who held it while it turned. And perhaps for that reason, when we speak of the Victorian era, we do not speak only of a reign, but of an entire way of understanding the world. The thread of that story, however, does not begin with her coronation, nor in the halls of Buckingham, but in the dim corridors and closed gardens of Kensington Palace, where the girl who would be queen first learned to distrust, then to resist, and finally to rule. The golden days of Kensington Palace. Before becoming the sovereign of an empire that would cover nearly a quarter of the planet, Victoria was simply a child. A tiny figure, wrapped in lace, wide-eyed before a world that was shown to her only in carefully controlled fragments. Her early years did not unfold amid the bustle of the halls of Buckingham, nor among journeys across the kingdom, but within the cloistered walls of Kensington Palace, a majestic building on the outside, yet transformed into a golden cage for the girl who inhabited it from infancy. There, in that setting of heavy curtains, silent corridors, and carefully watched gardens, not only the character of a queen was shaped, but also the seed of an era. Because what happened within the walls of Kensington was not merely a personal story, it was an unconscious preparation for a destiny not yet clearly envisioned, but already sensed in the way every detail of her life was calculated, restricted, and measured as if the slightest error might alter the course of history. Victoria would not remember her father. Edward, Duke of Kent, had died of pneumonia before she reached her first birthday. It was a void that would never be filled, yet in a way it set the tone for her upbringing. No father figure, No siblings, no spontaneous play. Only her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and a man whose shadow would follow her until her coronation, Sir John Conroy. The name may sound unremarkable, but for years, he held more control over Victoria's life than any member of the British Parliament. Conroy was the Duchess's personal secretary, and in practice, her main advisor and administrator. Intelligent, ambitious, and manipulative, he designed, alongside Victoria's mother, an educational regime as rigid as it was suffocating. They called it the Kensington system, a set of rules devised to keep the future heiress under constant control. Victoria was not allowed to be alone for even a moment. She could not leave the palace unaccompanied, nor speak without supervision, nor write letters without them being reviewed. Her routines were programmed down to the minute, from the first ray of sunlight to the extinguishing of the candelabras at night. She slept in the same room as her mother until a surprisingly late age. She had no close friends, shared no games, and barely knew members of her own family. What that system aimed for was not so much to educate her as to mold her, to turn her into a docile instrument, easy to steer. Conroy dreamed of becoming regent if Victoria ascended the throne while still a minor, and his strategy involved eliminating any trace of independence. But the effect was the opposite. That child, forced to smile and obey throughout the day, began to develop in secret a quiet, persistent resistance that would later allow her to free herself from that control with surprising coldness. That tension between obedience and rebellion was not visible from the outside. Visitors to the palace found a well-mannered young girl, modestly dressed, reserved and polite. But within her, a deep conflict was already forming between the submission she had been taught and the personal will that was demanding space. In her diaries, which she wrote in diligently throughout her life, that constant discomfort can be read between the lines. The rigidity of the Kensington system did not protect her from the world. It kept her locked in a reduced, false version of it. The Duchess of Kent, for her part, did not act out of cruelty, at least not consciously. She had arrived in England as a foreigner, with unfamiliar customs, a marked accent, and an unstable position within the royal family. Her husband Edward had died in debt, and she was forced to defend her daughter's future in a court that viewed her with suspicion. Conroy was her support, her shield, her strategist. Together they designed an education they believed infallible, but which ended up leaving deep wounds. Despite the restrictions, Victoria began showing signs of character early on. She was stubborn, loyal to her instincts, with a prodigious memory and a sharp intellect. She enjoyed reading, especially historical novels and travel tales. She had a soft spot for animals, for the tall trees in the garden, and for the paintings that adorned the palace's oldest halls. She was drawn to what she could not have: freedom, play, spontaneous contact with the outside world. Family relationships were tense. Her uncles, the sons of George III, saw her as a threat to their personal ambitions. No one truly believed such a fragile child would one day reign. But the line of succession was clear, and every day without another heir being born strengthened her position. The pressure on her grew silently, like dampness seeping into the walls unnoticed at first. It was in this context that the foundations of her public persona were laid: reserve, prudence, emotional control. Qualities that would later be seen as signs of stability, but which had originated as defense mechanisms. Victoria learned that any excess, any misplaced word, could turn against her. She learned to measure her gestures, to keep her thoughts private, to build a facade that would protect her from the world around her. With time, that mask ceased to be an artifice and became part of her identity. Victoria was not pretending to be strong. She had cultivated that strength in silence, in solitude, over the course of a childhood where decisions were always made for her, and where the only things that truly belonged to her were her thoughts, her journals, and that underground will that never fully allowed itself to be tamed. When she finally learned she was queen, her first reaction was a mix of solemnity and relief. What had ended was not only the previous reign, it was her childhood as a prisoner. Her first act as monarch was to order Conroy to permanently withdraw from her affairs, and she began to distance herself from her mother. There was no public confrontation, but there was a clear change of posture that made it evident that the obedient girl from Kensington had been left behind. From that confinement did not emerge merely a queen, but a woman accustomed to taking control of her own circumstances, a figure who would stand firm even before prime ministers, ambassadors, and internal enemies. Someone who had not learned to reign in gilded halls or diplomatic academies, but in the oppressive silence of a palace that had underestimated her while unwittingly preparing her to endure. Those early years did not shine like a fairy tale. They were hard, dim, almost claustrophobic. But within that darkness, the pulse of a monarch was already beating, one who, without seeking it, would end up shaping the sensibility of an entire age. And while that will was being affirmed in the palace's chambers, the outside world was beginning to stir with its own momentum. Factories roared, cities expanded, newspapers heralded new ideas, and in Westminster, political parties prepared for a new era. Everything was changing, and at the center of that imminent transformation, she had already found her place. Victoria in the mirror of power. The day Victoria ascended to the throne, power was still an abstract concept. It was not in her crown, nor in the scepter ceremoniously placed in her hand, nor in the golden throne where she sat for official portraits. It was rather a shadow, a diffuse presence that floated around her, that surrounded her with expectation, that waited, in silence, like so many things in that era, for her to acknowledge it. Because although she already had the title, the responsibility, the portraits, and the anthems, Victoria still did not fully understand what it meant to be queen. Not in the practical sense, nor in the symbolic, nor in the emotional. And yet, something began to fall into place the moment she found herself alone in Buckingham Palace. For the first time, she had space. There was silence around her, but it was not the controlled and watchful silence of Kensington. It was her own silence, where her thoughts could grow without fear of being trimmed by an adult figure lurking nearby. She was free, even if she did not yet fully understand what that word implied. The first days were uncertain, delicate, as if she were walking on thin ice. Every step had to be measured with extreme care, because every gesture was being watched by an entire country that did not yet trust her. The court observed her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The politicians did not quite know how to treat such a young queen. The nobility waited for signs of continuity. The people wanted hope, and she, surrounded by freshly painted walls, faced all of this with a resolve that surprised even those who had thought her fragile. There was in her a silent determination, a firmness that did not need to raise its voice. Her first great political ally noticed it immediately. Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister at the time, a refined and educated man with a past marked by personal tragedies and a wisdom tinged with melancholy. For Victoria, Melbourne was more than an advisor. He was a guide, a paternal figure, a mirror in which to test her developing authority. They shared long conversations in the palace gardens or in front of the glowing fireplaces. He taught her the intricacies of politics, the names, the hidden interests, the maneuvers of power. And she listened with a mix of humility and sharpness, learning not only the facts but the forms, the subtleties, the silences that speak more than speeches. Their relationship stirred whispers. Some saw Melbourne as an excessive influence, almost a shadow deciding on her behalf. Others believed Victoria had fallen in love. The truth is that this friendship was crucial to the transition from the observed girl to the woman beginning to rule. Melbourne did not use her or tame her, but offered her a way to understand the world without paternalism. recognizing in her a capacity that many still refuse to see. Victoria admired him, yes, but not as one who idolizes, rather as one who has finally found a shared language. The years that followed were an unending school. Every decision made by her government was attributed to her, even if she had not participated directly. Every conflict between liberals and conservatives was projected onto her figure. Every moral debate, every social scandal, found in the Queen a reference, a constant presence that was expected to respond with poise. In that sense, she was a modern monarch before her time, more a symbol than a ruler, more presence than direct action, but not for that reason any less influential. One of the first tests of her own judgment came in the so-called Ladies of the Bedchamber episode. It seemed a minor issue. The new Prime Minister, Robert Peel, a conservative, demanded that some of the Queen's personal ladies-in-waiting be replaced by women aligned with his party. Victoria firmly refused. To her, those women were friends, confidants, an essential part of her world. Peel interpreted her refusal as a lack of political neutrality. Tension escalated. He resigned. Melbourne temporarily returned to power. And although institutionally the episode was complex, for Victoria it was a quiet declaration of autonomy. She would not surrender her personal life in the name of partisan balance. From that moment on, no one underestimated her capacity to decide for herself again. That gesture marked a turning point. The young queen was no longer merely a ceremonial figure raised to nod. She had judgment, convictions, and was willing to hold her ground even against the most influential men in the country. Over time, she developed a moral vision of power, closer to a spiritual responsibility than a direct exercise of command. She did not intervene in laws or reforms, but her image was used as a social compass, as a symbolic filter. Her private conduct mattered as much as her institutional role. What she wore, how she spoke, whom she received, all of it was interpreted as a message. And she learned from very early on to manage that implicit language with an almost instinctive intelligence. That mirror of power in which she began to see herself did not reflect immediate greatness. It did not offer the shine of conquests or military glory. It reflected steadiness. It reflected balance. It reflected a way of being without imposing, of organizing without raising one's voice. And although that way of ruling does not appear in traditional history books, it was that stance, solid, silent, persistent, that allowed the United Kingdom to undergo decades of transformation without falling apart. Meanwhile, the country kept changing. The factories multiplied their noise, the cities overflowed, the first locomotives crossed the English countryside at unimaginable speeds, and a new middle class began to raise its voice. The Queen did not dictate industrial policies or organize railroads, but hers was the face that appeared on every coin, on every commemorative medal, on every portrait hung in schools and public buildings. She was the presence that accompanied the change, even when she did not lead it. And although Melbourne's presence would remain important for some time, his departure from power marked the beginning of a new chapter. Victoria was beginning to walk with her own stride. She was no longer a student. She no longer needed power explained to her. She had observed it, had felt it surround her, and had learned to inhabit it naturally. She was not an aggressive leader, but she was firm. She was not charismatic in the style of great orators, but her seriousness inspired respect. She had been born to represent, and in that representation she found her greatest strength. That mirror of power did not distort or dazzle her. It returned to her an image she learned to carry with dignity for more than 6 decades. And in that reflection, the British people also began to find an idea of themselves: order, decorum, patience, purpose. Not a nation of grand gestures, but a nation of elegant endurance. With every audience, with every public act, with every national celebration, Victoria solidified herself not as a leader of battles, but as the invisible frame that gave shape to the entire picture. And within that frame, politics, the economy, culture, and customs began to organize, as if the century already knew where to look. Inside the palace, however, something different was beginning to take root. A feeling that escaped strategy, that did not obey protocol. Because in the midst of that constant learning, among speeches, ceremonies, and responsibilities, a new figure began to cross her path. Someone who would arrive from distant lands, not to dispute her power, but to disrupt the very logic of her private world. And with him, the destiny of the monarchy would take an unexpected turn. The prince who changed the kingdom. In a country ruled for centuries by men and shaped by dynasties where marriage had more to do with politics than love, no one expected the bond between Victoria and her future husband to be built on something as outdated as genuine passion. And yet, that is exactly what happened. A love at first sight, yes, but also a profound recognition, an intuition that needed no grand speeches or dynastic negotiations. From the very beginning, she knew that this young man, shy and neat, with elegant manners and a melancholic face, was destined not only to share her life, but also the weight of the throne. Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha arrived in England at barely 20 years old, invited by the Queen as a potential marital candidate. He was Victoria's cousin, as was customary among European royal houses, and descended from a German line already interwoven with that of the Hanoverians. But beyond the genealogical chart, what captured Victoria's attention was his quiet intelligence, his serene composure, his steady and sincere gaze. In her diary, after their first formal meeting, she wrote with restrained emotion that she found him exquisitely handsome and charming, and that she loved him from the bottom of her soul. The marriage was soon arranged. On February 10, 1840, the ceremony took place in the Royal Chapel of St. James's Palace. Victoria wore a white satin gown, a choice that would end up shaping bridal fashion for generations to come, and a handmade Honiton lace veil. It was not a wedding imposed by the interests of the state, but a personal decision that silently defied the conventions of European royalty. She chose him. She proposed to him, because as queen she had both the right and the strength to do so. But beyond the romance, the true meaning of that union would become clear over time. Albert was not simply a decorative consort. He had no interest in banquets or superficial appearances. From the very beginning, he understood that he could become a key figure in the reign if he found a way to embed his vision into the British institutional machinery. And that is exactly what he sought to do, with patience, with strategy, and above all, with an almost obsessive commitment to the social and moral improvement of the country. At first, his role was ambiguous. The British Constitution did not grant the Queen's husband a defined political role. He had no legal power, no parliamentary voice. Many viewed him with suspicion, as a foreigner meddling in the affairs of a nation proud of its independence. But Albert was not intimidated. He started slowly, taking charge of the administrative aspects of the royal household, modernizing the court's finances, organizing correspondence, supervising the children's education. It seemed like domestic work, almost invisible, but in reality, it laid the foundation for a style of governance that valued order, planning, and efficiency over spectacle. Through these small, everyday reforms, Albert built influence. And as Victoria increasingly trusted his judgment, that influence extended into matters of state. His interest in science, education, industry, and architecture was more than a personal passion. It was a proposal to transform the spirit of a nation. He promoted technical education, public access to knowledge, infrastructure development, the creation of museums, libraries, and public parks. He was a man of the 19th century, with a vision that seemed almost of the 20th. During the most intense years of their collaboration, Albert became a sort of unofficial prime minister. He did not make legislative decisions, but his opinion was present in every report, every diplomatic meeting, every important resolution. He was meticulous, demanding, obsessive about detail. He woke up early, read reports late into the night, and wrote notes in precise handwriting. His level of commitment to the state machinery was such that some contemporaries accused him of being too German, too serious, too moralistic. But behind that judgment was something deeper. A growing discomfort with the emergence of a figure who proved that power did not have to speak loudly or act heroically. It could be exercised through discipline, consistency, and long-term thinking. Victoria adored him, though they also clashed. It was not an idealized or submissive relationship. They argued, disagreed, reconciled. She was emotional, impulsive, loyal to her affections. He was rational, logical, methodical. But this difference in temperament, far from dividing them, became complementary. While one ruled with the heart, the other contributed reason. While she connected with the people through symbolism, he pushed the nation toward the quiet modernity of statistics, machines, educational institutions, and international exhibitions. It was precisely through one of these initiatives that Albert reached the peak of his reformist vision: the organization of the Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace. A monumental event conceived to showcase to the world the industrial, scientific, and cultural achievements of the United Kingdom and other nations. A showcase of what progress could offer when guided by method and purpose. Beneath that iron and glass structure, surrounded by machines, textiles, telescopes, and objects from all corners of the globe, Albert emerged as the figure who best embodied the spirit of the age. Austere, yet ambitious. Reserved, yet visionary. Deeply moral without being dogmatic. But the most remarkable aspect of his influence was his impact within the royal household. Victoria and Albert built a family ideal that became a model for Britain's middle classes. With their 9 children, their holidays in Scotland, their carriage rides, and their family portraits hung on thousands of walls, they offered an image of monarchy that was domestic, intimate, accessible. They were not a distant and divine clan, but a couple who held hands, who read together by the fire, who mourned the death of a child and celebrated the birth of a grandchild. In an age of crisis of faith and social acceleration, that image of unity and stability had a profound effect. In an increasingly turbulent world, they offered the illusion of a steady center. Albert changed the kingdom not through decrees or speeches, but through ideas, through work, through an ethic that placed duty above prestige. And in doing so, he also changed Victoria. The young queen who had begun her reign amid suspicion and rigidity learned through her husband that power could have a human face, that ruling was not only about imposing, but also about organizing, understanding, and improving what was often invisible. When he was by her side, Victoria found not just companionship, but balance, a compass amid the storms. And as that alliance grew stronger, the United Kingdom was transforming at an astonishing pace. New social classes were emerging, cities were growing upward, factories marked a new rhythm, and the empire began to stretch like a living web across the world. Each day brought a new challenge, and the monarchy had to respond with more than solemnity. It had to offer direction, confidence, continuity. That confidence was built in private, in the palace hallways, in the salons where reports were read and maps were studied, in the rooms where the heirs slept. The invisible fabric of the new century was being woven, and at the center of that fabric stood the two of them, so different, yet so dependent on one another, bearing not only the crown, but the expectations of millions. And although no one knew it yet, not even they themselves, that balance, which seemed unbreakable, was doomed to fracture at the most unexpected moment, when fate, as it so often does in great stories, would introduce a silent yet devastating twist, capable of forever altering the course of history. behind the curtains of the Victorian home. If one walked through the streets of London in the 1850s and looked up at the tall windows of the well-to-do neighborhoods, one could see between the lace curtains the same ritual repeated like a collective echo. The father leaving early with top hat and cane, the mother overseeing the servants and the children's morality, the children memorizing psalms and multiplication tables under the watchful eye of a governess. At first glance, that scene appeared orderly, functional, predictable. But what was truly being built in those homes was an invisible architecture that would define the cultural heart of the Victorian era. The sanctification of the family, the cult of domestic virtue, and the growing belief that the world could remain in balance if the home remained pure. At the pinnacle of that idealized model were, of course, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. From their residences in Buckingham, Windsor, or Balmoral, they projected an image that the entire country adopted as a moral standard. They appeared in family engravings, portrayed with their children in gardens and libraries, surrounded by toys, books, and flowers. Without words, they presented a simple yet powerful idea. The monarchy was not only a political institution, it was also an exemplary family. And in that gesture lay a new way of exercising power. Not through laws or armies, but through the silent pedagogy of daily life. The house ceased to be merely a private space and became a kind of moral sanctuary. Everything that happened within its walls had to follow a logic of order, respect, sacrifice, and restraint. Rooms were divided with precision. The masculine in the study, the feminine in the drawing room, the servile in the invisible spaces of the basement. The parlor became a theatrical stage where virtue was enacted daily, and where every gesture, every word, every habit carried symbolic weight. The walls did not merely divide space, they marked roles, hierarchies, and social aspirations. The concept of the angel of the home gained strength. The woman, excluded from public life, found in the home her place of influence and duty. She was responsible for protecting the husband's morality, shaping the children's character, and maintaining domestic harmony like one tending a sacred flame. She was not asked for blind obedience, but for absolute devotion to that ideal. Her value was not measured in titles or income, but in her ability to sustain the delicate balance of a world where emotion had to be moderated and virtue had to shine even in silence. The education of children was an essential part of that structure. From a young age, they were instructed in moral duties before technical knowledge. Honesty, humility, self-discipline, and faith were considered more important pillars than any practical skill. Girls were taught to embroider, to serve tea, to manage feelings with discretion. Boys were trained to be upright, punctual, and responsible, destined to take up a productive role in the public sphere. Childhood, for the first time, was wrapped in an atmosphere of idealization that aimed to make it a pure and formative space, even if that did not always align with reality. In middle and upper-class households, the ritual was supported by a perfectly tiered service structure. Butlers, cooks, maids, governesses, chauffeurs, laundresses, each knew exactly what they had to do, when to do it, and what their place was in the machinery. There was no room for improvisation or rebellion. The house had to function like a clock. A failure in the routine, a poorly set table, a neglected uniform, and the order would crack. But that order was as fragile as it was artificial. It was often upheld by low wages, exhausting hours, and entire lives dedicated to serving an ideal of virtue that did not include them. However, it was in aesthetics that this ideal found its most seductive form. Victorian furniture became a symbol of respect and prosperity. Padded sofas, glass cabinets with porcelain, pendulum clocks, heavy curtains, oriental carpets. Every object told a story, spoke of cultivated tastes, of real or imagined journeys, of a sensibility that mixed romanticism with solemnity. The home was the refuge of the soul, but also a public declaration of status. Visitors did not simply see a drawing room, they read an identity. Among working-class families, this idealization was harder to achieve, but no less aspired to. As literacy advanced and bourgeois values filtered through novels, newspapers, and sermons, even the humblest homes began to replicate, on their own scale, the same scheme. A clean table, a pious mother, a hard-working father, obedient children. Morality became a shared aspiration, often more important than comfort or abundance. Poverty was bearable if it did not bring shame. Yet beneath that harmonious facade were constant tensions. Many women found themselves trapped in a role that denied them any personal ambition beyond the walls of their home. The ideal of the perfect mother and selfless wife demanded deep emotional sacrifices and often painful silences. There was no talk of depression, dissatisfaction, or abuse. Everything had to be resolved in the discretion of the private sphere, as if the domestic had nothing to do with the political. In extreme cases, that ideal became a prison. Women confined in routines without escape, men overwhelmed by the expectation of being flawless providers, children subjected to strict disciplines that confused duty with fear. Homes could be temples of virtue or beautifully decorated cells, depending on who lived in them and how they bore the invisible weight of daily obligation. Even so, the ideal of the Victorian home left an indelible mark on the collective unconscious. The idea that the foundation of any healthy society is a stable family, that conjugal love is inseparable from moral duty, that intimacy must be guided by higher principles, all of that, born among lace, china, sermons, and portraits, survived the century and continues to resonate in many forms of modern life. And while that world was being ordered within the walls of houses, outside, change accumulated without rest. Factories roared, neighborhoods expanded, newspapers brought news from distant colonial territories, and social tensions began to knock on the doors of that idealized home. Because no matter how firm the walls were, the world did not stop at the threshold. Sooner or later, the city would find its way in. The shadows of progress in the streets of London. London, in the central years of the 19th century, was a living creature, immense, chaotic, breathing through its chimneys, pulsing in its markets, and spilling over the banks of the Thames like a city that never quite learned to contain itself. From the heights of Mayfair to the damp tunnels of Whitechapel, the capital of the empire expanded without pause, as if time itself had accelerated in every brick, every factory, every carriage that rumbled across soot-covered avenues. On the surface, it was the city of progress, but within, it harbored shadows thicker than the fog that wrapped it each morning without asking permission. There was something unsettling in that constant transformation, something almost spectral. Old neighborhoods were demolished to make way for wide avenues and train stations. Tunnels were dug without knowing exactly what kind of air they would breathe. Buildings rose, aiming for the sky, yet hiding in their basements entire lives crushed beneath smoke and silence. Factories whistled from dawn until late at night, and chimneys became modern obelisks, dark symbols of a revolution that brought both promises and curses. The bustle of the streets was a new language. The cries of street vendors mixed with the metallic rumble of carts, the laughter of barefoot children dashing through puddles of stagnant water, the distant tolling of church bells, the heated debates in cafes where people spoke of politics, of science, of reform. And beneath it all, like a melody that never ceased, the constant murmur of the crowd. London spoke, argued, breathed, and also hurt. The air people inhaled was not innocent. With each breath came a bit of coal, a bit of mold, a bit of despair. Houses were built one atop the other. Alleys narrowed. Interior courtyards filled with filth and forgotten lives. There was no space for gardens, nor for rest. Progress was urgent and had no regard for aesthetics or health. Epidemics soon made the city their home. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis spread through working-class neighborhoods like stains that could not be washed away. Wastewater flowed through the streets. Cemeteries were overflowing. Death hung in the air amid the urban frenzy. And yet, there was beauty in the chaos. A cruel, melancholic, almost supernatural beauty. The sunsets painted the city in gold and ash. Gas lamps flickered above damp sidewalks. Bookstores lit their windows with freshly printed editions. In the parks, one could still hear the whisper of trees amid so much iron and smoke. It was a landscape of constant contradiction, brutal and delicate, noisy and poetic, monumental and miserable. The contrasts were so stark that no one could ignore them. While in the West End, ladies attended the opera in silk gowns and perfumes imported from India. In the East End, just a few kilometers away, women and children rummaged through garbage heaps in search of something to eat or sell. Wealth moved along the great avenues in gleaming carriages, but one needed only to turn a corner to find poverty, disease, the vacant stares of those who no longer expected anything. Newspapers began to record that abyss with unsettling precision. The chronicles of Henry Mayhew portrayed the lives of the dispossessed with raw detail: the bootblacks, the match sellers, the sewer scavengers. Charles Dickens turned those streets into protagonists of his novels, giving them a voice that resonated beyond the page. Because London was not just a setting, it was a tragic and living character that changed by the hour, defying anyone who tried to understand it through simple categories. Architecture became one of the languages through which the city attempted to say who it was and where it was headed. Train stations grew like cathedrals of iron. Bridges connected riverbanks that had never touched before. Theaters, museums, banks, and courts were built. And though many of these buildings were reserved for the elite, they all contributed to shaping the city's new silhouette. A silhouette no longer belonging to kings or nobles, but to engineers, merchants, laborers, and bankers. Medieval London was being buried beneath the ruins of the future. The transportation system also transformed the rhythm of urban life. Horse-drawn omnibuses marked the first public routes. Later came the trams, and finally the underground, that subterranean network that seemed straight out of a ghost story. In its early days, traveling underground inspired as much fascination as fear. It was a perfect symbol of the era, moving through dark tunnels with the hope of emerging elsewhere. Farther, higher, faster. And amid all this motion, crime found fertile ground. The anonymity of the city allowed people to vanish, to change names, to start anew, or to fall forever. Narrow streets were havens for thieves, smugglers, swindlers, and murderers. The newly formed Metropolitan Police had little experience and even fewer resources. Detectives were beginning to appear as new figures, half men of science, half readers of souls. The city became a chessboard where complex games played out, where morality, law, and necessity blurred without clear boundaries. In the midst of the chaos, voices rose calling for reform. Philanthropists denounced the conditions of unsanitary housing. Doctors warned of the risks of pollution. Some architects dreamed of urban gardens, of ventilated homes, of neighborhoods where dignity did not depend on income. But economic interests were powerful, and the speed of urban growth left little room for ethics. Progress advanced like a train without brakes, dragging with it both marvels and miseries. London was not a city that could be understood from a single perspective. It had to be walked with one's feet, listened to attentively, its smoke breathed in, its walls touched. Only then would it reveal its complexity. A city of extremes, where hope coexisted with horror, where luxury brushed against rot, where the future was built upon the still warm remnants of the past. And while factories kept belching smoke, and avenues continued to widen to make way for new forms of life, on the margins of that constant transformation, other stories grew, smaller, but equally important. Stories of stolen childhoods, of endless workdays, of small hands that silently held up everything the city pretended to celebrate as progress. The lords of smoke and cotton. On the margins of that London rising between mist and brick, beyond its avenues where urban chaos disguised itself as civilization, the true centers of power of the century unfolded silently. The factories. And not only in the capital, but in every corner of the country where there was a river to feed machines, a mine to offer coal, or a city desperate enough to sell its waking hours to the highest bidder. The Industrial Revolution, which in textbooks is described with dates and graphs, in real life felt more like a continuous roar, a constant vibration beneath one's feet, a promise wrapped in sweat, smoke, and metallic noise that transformed not only the economy, but also the very skin of those who touched it. In the north of England, in cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, or Birmingham, the landscape changed at the same pace as the spinning of the automatic looms. The old merchant towns were swallowed by smoking chimneys, endless warehouses, and trains that arrived each hour with coal and departed with processed goods. Where once there were farms and dirt paths, now there were turbines, meters, cranes, wires, and an almost feverish energy that permeated every street, as if time itself had accelerated its course without looking back. At the head of this new world were the industrial entrepreneurs, figures who had never been nobles or soldiers, but who now amassed a wealth and influence that rivaled the great aristocratic houses. They were the lords of smoke and cotton, the owners of textile factories, steel foundries, coal mines, shipping companies, and banks. Their names were rarely engraved on monuments, but they were present on every invoice, in every sack of flour, in every piece of cloth that crossed the seas toward the colonies. Many of them had been born without fortune, sons of merchants, artisans, or even shepherds, and had carved their way in this new universe where money began to replace lineage as the true measure of power. The Industrial Revolution did not just change how goods were produced, it completely altered the social hierarchy. For the first time, someone without a noble surname could build an empire from nothing, provided they could do the math, understand the market, negotiate with bluntness, and above all, not look too closely at those crushed along the way. Because industrial success, dazzling as it was, came at a human cost that could not be ignored. Workdays stretched to 14, 15, even 16 hours. The factories were poorly ventilated, accidents were frequent, and respiratory diseases spread with the speed of an epidemic. Often the machines did not even stop for meals. The worker's body was seen as an extension of the machinery, useful while it functioned, disposable once broken. Cotton, that soft material filling the wardrobes of the emerging middle classes, turned into dust in the lungs of those who processed it. The looms were deafening to the point of madness. Hands became coated in grease, fingernails blackened, eyes bloodshot from constant focus. Iron, steam, and speed were all celebrated as symbols of progress, but very few wanted to see what happened behind industrial doors. And yet, within that brutal model, there was also a logic of efficiency and purpose. The industrialists were not, in most cases, ruthless villains. Many saw themselves as builders of a new civilization. They established schools for their workers' children, funded hospitals, and supported charitable works. They were convinced that disciplined labor, mass production, and technology could uplift all of society, so long as society accepted sacrifice as a necessary step. The word progress began to take on an almost religious tone. It was printed in newspapers, recited in parliamentary speeches, and taught in schools as an inevitable destiny. The factory became the new temple of modernity. Its architecture, functional and austere, its shifts marked by the whistle of boilers, its strict schedules, all created a routine that extended beyond its walls. The clock ceased to be a luxury and became an indispensable tool. Time began to organize life more than ever before. And while the industrialists built mansions outside the cities, the workers crowded into unhealthy neighborhoods where houses shared damp walls, where water was scarce and privacy non-existent. The streets of those neighborhoods were muddy, the nights were dark, and the bodies were tired to the bone. But even there, a new form of identity was being born: class consciousness. The Victorian worker was not passive. He learned to read, to organize, to discuss wages, to demand rights. The first trade unions, still persecuted and fragile, began to take shape. Whispers of strikes, cooperatives, and labor reforms began to circulate. At first, politicians responded with disdain or fear. But gradually, social movements began to push open the doors of Parliament. Laws regulating child labor, work hours, and factory safety were slow to arrive, but they began to seep into the legal machinery. The voice of smoke, of sweat, of anonymous effort began to be heard beyond the brick walls. At the same time, a unique industrial culture was emerging. Songs were sung during breaks. There were rituals among workers, shared symbols. The factories were not only spaces of production. They were complete communities with internal codes, affections, and small everyday rebellions that reminded everyone that even among gears, humanity endured. The figure of the modern entrepreneur, that man with a tall hat, a groomed mustache, and a calculating gaze, became a symbol of the era. He was the pioneer, the innovator, the organizer of chaos. Sometimes, he was also the exploiter, the one who fired without warning, the one who cut wages at the slightest drop in demand. But for many, he represented the possibility of upward mobility, the promise that the future belonged to those who knew how to adapt, work hard, and look beyond the present. In those days, owning a factory was not merely about accumulating wealth. It meant participating in a larger, almost epic narrative in which a new nation was being built. Every mile of railway, every ship loaded with goods, every steam engine seemed to push England toward a place of economic and moral supremacy. And if that progress claimed lives along the way, it was seen, at least from the perspective of power, as a necessary sacrifice. But on the margins of that narrative, the small stories kept beating. The stories of workers who did not return home after an accident, of mothers waiting for Saturday's wages to buy bread, of men who dreamed of days off without smoke or sirens. Because no matter how tall the chimneys were, there was always something beneath them that could not be measured in numbers or production reports. The concrete, everyday silent life of those who, without seeking it, bore the full weight of that revolution on their shoulders. And as the gears kept turning and the goods crossed oceans in search of new markets, an entire generation of workers began to wonder whether progress had space for their children, or whether the price would continue to be paid by the most exhausted. Small hands in an age of iron. In the mechanical vastness of Victorian England, where machines roared without rest and smoke wrote its own story in the sky, there were small hands that carried more than they ever should have had to bear. Trembling hands, calloused hands, clumsy from the cold, quick out of necessity. Hands of children who could not read or write, but who first learned to obey the rhythm of a loom, the hiss of a boiler, the screech of a pulley. In a century that celebrated progress, scientific advancement, and commercial expansion, child labor was an open secret, an immense crack hidden behind the shine of shop windows and the efficiency of new schedules. Children in the Victorian era were not seen as symbols of innocence, at least not in the neighborhoods where bread was scarce and coal was more valuable than childhood. They were simply cheap labor. From as young as 5 or 6 years old, many began workdays as long as those of any adult, under even crueler conditions. They were the right size to slip between gears, had the agility to clean chimneys, and the silence of those raised not to complain. In the textile factories of the North, for instance, it was common to see them walking in line at dawn, their eyes still heavy with sleep, their stomachs empty, and wearing clothes handed down by older siblings. They entered enormous halls where the noise of the looms became unbearable within minutes. There, among spinning wheels and ceaseless moving parts, their task was to prevent the production line from stopping. They removed tangled threads, picked scraps off the floor, adjusted parts while the machines kept running. A blink, a wrong move, was enough to lose a finger, an arm, sometimes an entire life. Suspended cotton dust crept into their lungs without permission. Many developed chronic respiratory diseases before reaching 10 years old. But as long as their bodies held up, no one stopped them. Employers knew they would not ask for days off. They would not protest, and they would accept whatever wage they were given without questioning its value. And if they became sick or suffered an accident, there were others waiting. There were always more. In the coal mines, the picture was just as brutal. The so-called trapper boys were children in charge of opening and closing underground trapdoors for the coal wagons. They worked in complete darkness for 12 or 14 hours, with a candle if they were lucky, with frozen fingers and cramped legs. They stayed in the same spot for the entire shift, breathing damp air, listening to the echoes of passing wagons and the groans of the living rock that could collapse at any moment. Down there, they lost all sense of time. Upon emerging, many walked like sleepwalkers, eyes lost, backs bent as if the tunnel had clung to their skin. In the poorest homes, no child was exempt. Children sold matches, cleaned boots, collected rags, delivered newspapers, worked as servants, or helped their parents with temporary jobs. They were offered no education, no care, no rest. Poverty dictated their schedules, and fear kept them disciplined. They learned early that crying solved nothing, that tenderness was a luxury, that dreams belonged to others. The girls, in addition to bearing the same burdens, were put to domestic tasks from an early age. Many entered as live-in servants in strangers' homes, sometimes as young as 9 or 10 years old. They slept in basements, ate leftovers, and endured humiliations normalized as part of their service. The most unfortunate ended up in child prostitution, trapped in silent networks where no one searched for them, and almost no one saw them. Childhood, for much of the 19th century, was a stage without rites, a forced passage between birth and physical exhaustion. Only over time, thanks to the work of reformers, journalists, doctors, and a few sensitive politicians, did space for reflection and resistance begin to open. The numbers could no longer be hidden. The testimonies were too stark. The country that boasted of its modernity could no longer justify its industries functioning at the cost of fragile bones and tiny lungs. Thus began the first official reports. One of the most impactful was the report of the Children's Employment Commission, published in the 1840s, which documented inhumane working conditions in factories, mines, and workshops. The words of the children interviewed, simple, direct, often barely articulated, revealed a truth impossible to soften. They slept little, ate poorly, became sick quickly, and died young. All for a few coins which, in many cases, they never even saw, as they were handed to their parents or deducted for food and lodging. The first protective laws were timid and poorly enforced. They limited work hours, set minimum ages, proposed inspections. But in practice, factories found ways to evade them, and parents, pressured by necessity, accepted forged documents or irregular conditions just to bring something home. It was a system built on mutual desperation. No one defended it openly, but everyone depended on it. And yet, something began to change. As critical voices gained ground, the figure of the child began to be redefined. Idealized images of childhood began to emerge in literature, painting, and pedagogy. People began to speak of the right to play, to learn, to be cared for. Schools began to multiply, first in urban areas, then across the country. Mandatory literacy arrived slowly but had a deep impact. Charitable institutions were created, orphanages with educational programs, public initiatives that understood that the future of a nation could not be built upon the sacrifice of its youngest. By the end of the 19th century, child labor still existed, but it was no longer seen as natural. There was awareness, there were stricter laws, there were alternatives. The change was not immediate or total, but a new sensitivity had been planted. The country that for decades had exploited the energy of its children was finally beginning to listen to their voices. And in that quiet awakening, in that new social agreement beginning to take shape, lay the seed of another conflict. Because if it was acknowledged that children should not work under inhumane conditions, what else would need to be reconsidered? What did a dignified life truly mean? And how much of so-called progress needed to stop being measured in profits and start being measured in justice? Childhood, in the end, did not disappear. It learned to resist, to survive iron and smoke. And its stories, long relegated to oblivion, began to be written, to be sung, to be taught. As a reminder of what was, but also as a warning of what must never be again. Because every great machine, even the most admirable, always has hidden gears worth examining closely before we celebrate its perfection. The voices of hunger from Ireland. During the first half of the 19th century, Ireland was a land where appearances were deceiving. From afar, the island seemed to be a harmonious part of the United Kingdom, just another link in the imperial chain stretching from Victorian London to the farthest reaches of the world. But beneath the surface, the relationship between Ireland and Great Britain was anything but stable. Political, religious, and economic tensions accumulated like low clouds, heavy with an invisible electricity that official discourse preferred to ignore. And it was precisely in that atmosphere, saturated with inequality, that disaster found its most fertile ground. In 1845, a silent plague arrived unannounced in the Irish fields. Potato blight, a disease caused by a microscopic fungus, began rotting the crops from within, turning the tubers into black, inedible masses. In other parts of the world, the loss of a crop would have been serious, but not fatal. In Ireland, the situation was different. For millions of peasants, the potato was not just part of their diet, it was the absolute foundation of their survival. Without it, there was no breakfast, no dinner, no food at all for their children, no rent to pay the landowner. Within weeks, daily life collapsed. The famine did not erupt suddenly, like a storm. It was a slow, spiraling fall, a chain of delayed decisions, denials, and cold calculations. In the first year of the crisis, many still held on to hope. They believed the blight would pass, that the authorities would respond, that there would be enough aid. But the plague returned the following year, and the next, and with it came misery, disease, and social disintegration. Houses emptied of laughter, roads filled with skeletal figures, and fields fell silent, covered in seedless furrows. In London, Parliament watched with a mix of detachment and pragmatism. Sporadic aid was sent, emergency kitchens were created, small rations of maize were distributed. But the measures were insufficient, poorly organized, and above all, tainted by the moral logic of the time. British liberals were convinced that too much aid could foster dependence. They believed poverty was a symptom of character, not of the system. As a result, many public policies responded more to a desire to punish than to relieve. To receive food, for instance, peasants had to abandon their land, enter workhouses, and accept conditions that bordered on humiliation. It was charity with punishment. Meanwhile, Ireland bled. Between 1845 and 1852, more than 1 million people died of hunger or hunger-related diseases. Another million left the island, boarding overcrowded ships bound for America, Canada, or Australia. Many of these vessels were called coffin ships, fragile, filthy, dangerous. Hundreds died aboard before reaching land. Those who survived left with only the clothes on their backs, leaving behind not just their homes but also their language, their history, their dead without tombstones. The depopulation was so profound that even today, nearly 2 centuries later, Ireland has not regained the population it had before the famine. Entire villages disappeared. Churches stood without congregants. Fields were overtaken by weeds. It was a demographic wound, but also a cultural one. The Gaelic language suffered an irreversible setback. Oral traditions, ancient songs, family lineages were lost with those who died without witnesses. The entire nation entered a prolonged silent mourning, poisoned by a mix of sorrow, rage, and helplessness. And though nature triggered the tragedy, it was politics that amplified it to the point of irreversibility. During the years of the disaster, Ireland continued exporting food. Butter, wheat, barley, and meat left its ports bound for England, while people died in ditches. Landlords, many of them absentee and living in London, continued collecting rent. When peasants could no longer pay, they were evicted without mercy. In some cases, their homes were torn down over them as a symbolic act to prevent anyone from returning. The testimonies from the time are harrowing. There are letters written by women who buried 3, 4, even 5 children in the same month. There are descriptions of bodies found embracing along the roads, of mothers walking for miles with a dead child in their arms, hoping to find a hospital, a church, something. Newspapers of the era recorded scenes that seem impossible today, but that were part of daily life in rural Ireland. And each of those stories became another voice raised from the mud against the coldness of an administration that saw numbers where there were human beings. Over time, the famine became a painful collective memory, difficult to name, but impossible to erase. For millions of Irish people, both those who stayed and those who emigrated, it was the event that split history in two. It was the origin of a deep resentment toward England, a rage passed down through generations, which would later fuel movements for independence and resistance. In previous centuries, Ireland had seen wars, rebellions, occupations, but it had never suffered such a total emptiness, such an intimate loss. Because the famine did not just take bodies, it broke families, disfigured landscapes, and permanently altered the relationship between people and land. And though Queen Victoria sent personal donations and expressed concern, her image on the island would forever be associated with a monarchy that, at best, was indifferent, and at worst, complicit in the tragedy. The legacy of those years is still felt in family stories, in songs of lament, in the names of ships and ports. It is felt in the architecture of North American cities where thousands of Irish people built new lives without ever forgetting the old. It is felt in the silences of the generations born afterward, when speaking of the famine meant reopening a wound that many preferred to leave closed. But despite everything, life endured. Irish culture, so closely tied to resistance and imagination, found ways to survive, to transform, to sing even from within the loss. Poetry, theater, music, bitter humor, all became tools to name the unnameable, to reclaim what had been lost, even in fragments. And ever since, any attempt to recount the history of the Victorian era without passing through Ireland remains incomplete. For in those empty hills, and in those letters written with trembling hands, lies a truth that is uncomfortable but cannot be ignored. That progress, when unequal, can be just as destructive as war, and that empires do not always kill with rifles. The voices that rose from hunger did not die with their bodies. They remained in the island's damp wind, in the songs that crossed the Atlantic, in the eyes of the grandchildren of emigrants who, even today, remember, without ever having lived it, what it feels like when the world leaves you alone before the abyss. And while the United Kingdom continued expanding into Asia and Africa, believing its power to be invulnerable, the roots of an older conflict kept pulsing just a few miles from the heart of the empire. The empire's machine never sleeps. while in the streets of Manchester the looms never stopped spinning, and trains whistled through landscapes already tamed by the geometry of the railway. In the maps pinned on the walls of British government offices, a restless ambition was beginning to take shape. It was no longer enough to dominate trade, nor to take science to new heights, not even to discipline the working class within factories and strict schedules. What was now sought was deeper, more expansive, more ruthless. The British Empire, this ever-growing organism, needed to stretch its tentacles into every corner of the planet. It needed more ports, more routes, more raw materials, more destinations for its surplus goods, more territories upon which to project the idea that the world could and should be organized according to its rules. It was an empire that never slept, not because it suffered from insomnia, but because there was always a sun shining in one of its dominions. That phrase, proudly repeated by the propaganda of the time, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," was not an innocent metaphor. It was a declaration of control, of omnipresence. While the neighborhoods of London fell into darkness, colonial camps in India were awakening. While fog blanketed Edinburgh, flags were being raised on the coasts of Australia. The imperial machine operated like a clock whose pieces were scattered across the globe, perfectly assembled around a single center of gravity. But that machinery was not built upon ideals, but on interests. Trade was its lifeblood, the military its arm, administration its spine. And though the speeches spoke of civilization, evangelization, and order, the truth is that the driving force behind the gears was deeply economic. The colonies were sources of resources: gold, silver, sugar, tea, rubber, spices, rare minerals, timber, cotton. Each of those products had a story behind it, and each story concealed a complex web of violence, imposition, and inequality. The logic of the British Empire had a special quality. It did not rely solely on conquest through force, but knew how to infiltrate structures, how to use the language of law, trade, and diplomacy to disguise imposition as agreement. Where cannons could not reach, treaties were signed. Where there were no wars, concessions were granted. Where people resisted, internal divisions were organized. Domination was not a simple operation of military superiority. It was a subtle strategy of attrition, of adaptation, of gradually absorbing local power until reducing it to a decorative or irrelevant function. Africa, Asia, Oceania, the Caribbean, all became stages where the British flag was raised as a symbol of authority, while behind it operated administrators, merchants, bankers, bureaucrats, and missionaries. In many cases, occupation was carried out under the pretext of protection, mediation, or organization. The narrative of the empire as a bearer of stability and modernity was repeated in every schoolbook, in every sermon, in every world exposition. The empire was presented as the pinnacle of human progress. But on the ground, that progress was built upon forced displacement, systematic exploitation, cultural imposition, and an iron grip over economic and political structures. One of the most effective aspects of the system was its ability to present conquest as something inevitable. The collective imagination of the metropolis began to see the world not as a set of independent cultures, but as a board on which England had the duty, and even the moral right, to intervene. Images of backward, barbaric, or childlike peoples served as symbolic support for the justification of occupation. The civilizing mission did not need to prove its legitimacy. It only needed to be repeated. Communication played a crucial role. As the telegraph reduced the distance between colonies and capital and steamships shortened trade routes, the imperial network became denser, faster, more interconnected. Decisions could be made in London and executed in Bombay within days. Troops, raw materials, goods, and decrees could be transported with astonishing efficiency. This agility, unprecedented until then, gave the empire a decisive advantage over its competitors and reinforced the idea that ruling the world was as much a matter of logistics as of ideology. And yet, on the margins of that apparent perfection, tensions were beginning to grow. Local cultures did not passively accept domination. Resistance, although fragmented and often silenced in official records, was constant. There were rebellions, uprisings, boycotts, forced migrations, sabotage. From the Zulu peoples to Indian peasants, from religious leaders to women who protected their languages, to children who learned to read outside the colonial system, thousands of voices rose in different tones, with different methods, to declare that the imposed order was neither natural nor just. Within the United Kingdom itself, critical voices also emerged. Writers, intellectuals, dissident politicians, and journalists began to question the ethics of imperialism, its methods, its human impact. They asked what right one country had to draw arbitrary borders, to reconfigure foreign societies, to decide who should govern whom. Though these voices were in the minority, they laid the groundwork for a debate that would grow over the coming decades. And in the midst of it all, Queen Victoria became the symbol of that vast structure. With her image printed on postage stamps, coins, official portraits, and colonial proclamations, she was the visible face of a power that stretched from Canada to New Zealand, from Egypt to Ceylon. In 1876, she was proclaimed Empress of India, in a ceremony laden with symbolism that reinforced her position as Mother of the World, moral figure of the empire, embodiment of the order that sought to unite disparate cultures under a single banner. The figure of the Queen was useful because it unified. She was not a conqueror, not a soldier, not a politician. She was a presence, a signature, a face that could be read as maternal in the colonies and as a symbol of stability at home. And so, while the empire expanded in all directions, she remained immobile, like an axis. She did not make military decisions, but her name sealed treaties. She did not design colonial laws, but her authority legitimized them. She was the monarch of an island, but she ruled over seas and deserts. For many in England, that empire was a source of pride, of identity, of a sense of mission. For many others, it was a structure that distorted the very essence of justice. But the truth is that for decades, it worked. With efficiency, with calculated brutality, with meticulous administration. Like a machine that never stopped moving, that adjusted its parts on the go, that corrected mistakes without pausing, that learned, that grew, that devoured. And while that machine kept spinning, in its finest gears a subtle friction began to be felt. One of another story, more intimate, more cultural, more spiritual. Because although politics and trade gave the empire its shape, at its core, what began to weave itself between metropolis and colony was a more complex relationship, a web of symbols, customs, words, and obsessions that, over time, would profoundly alter the soul of the throne itself. The whispers of distant India. In the silent halls of Buckingham Palace, among British velvets, Chinese porcelain, and Persian carpets, there was something that captured the Queen's gaze with almost intimate devotion. Objects embroidered with golden threads, jade necklaces, fans inscribed with words she could not fully pronounce, and watercolor portraits of elephants. They were gifts from another land, fragments of a world that pulsed with more intense colors, denser aromas, and rituals that seemed ancient even when they were part of daily life. India was not just a colony on the maps hanging on the walls of the Foreign Office. For Victoria, it was a constant, enveloping, distant, and strangely close presence. An obsession that began to grow slowly, until it occupied the invisible center of her inner world. By the middle of the 19th century, India had become the brightest and most contentious jewel of the British Empire. But that jewel was not conquered in a single battle, nor ceded through one treaty. It was absorbed layer by layer, over decades, through forced agreements, commercial wars, and decisions made thousands of kilometers away. First came the British East India Company, a corporation with military power and its own currency, which infiltrated the fabric of the sultanates, divided alliances, imposed tariffs, and organized armies of natives trained under a foreign flag. Then, after a series of brutally suppressed uprisings, the Crown took direct control, and with that, India ceased to be a private business and became a matter of state, a formal extension of the empire. But what marked the deepest turning point, both symbolically and emotionally, was what happened in the year 1857. That year, the sepoys, Indian soldiers serving under British command, rose up in a fierce rebellion. What began as a military protest against the use of cartridges coated in animal fat, a practice that violated both Hindu and Muslim beliefs, became a national uprising against British domination. Cities burned, alliances shattered, wounds were torn wide open. The empire's response was relentless. Massacres, public executions, systematic repression. The message was clear. No uprising would be tolerated. Yet the rebellion also left a scar on London's conscience. From that moment, governing India could no longer be delegated. It required more attention, tighter control, a blend of severity and theatrical display. In the year 1876, Queen Victoria was officially proclaimed Empress of India. A gesture that was much more than a title. It was a way to claim, to symbolize, to project an image of imperial unity that, in reality, barely held together the fragments of a culture that never allowed itself to be fully assimilated. And still, between Victoria and India, a bond developed that went beyond politics. The Queen's fascination with that land grew over the years, to the point where she surrounded herself with objects, readings, servants, and advisors that symbolically connected her to a place she never visited. Among all of them, one would stand out above the rest: Abdul Karim. Abdul Karim was a young Muslim man sent from India to serve at court. But he quickly became more than a servant. He became the Queen's Hindi teacher, her confidant, her daily companion. He taught her phrases, read her poetry, spoke to her about Allah and Ramadan, explained the customs of northern India. Victoria called him the Munshi, master, and wrote about him in her diaries with genuine affection. She granted him privileges, gifts, and even intervened on behalf of his family. All of this caused deep discomfort at court, which never fully accepted the presence of an Indian man in such intimate spaces of power. The relationship between Victoria and Abdul was viewed with suspicion, with racism, with jealousy. High-ranking officials attempted to limit him, discredit him, expel him. But the Queen stood firm, even in her old age, defending her right to surround herself with someone who spoke to her in the language she wished to learn, someone who represented that other world to which she felt so emotionally bound. Some saw it as the eccentricity of an aging monarch, others as a scandal. But in truth, it was a sign that the empire, at times, also reached into the heart. Meanwhile, in the streets of Calcutta, Bombay, and Delhi, reality was much harsher. British rule had transformed social structures, agrarian systems, education, and architecture. English had been imposed as the official language, Anglo-Saxon law as the norm, and traditional elites were either displaced or co-opted. A new class of native bureaucrats emerged, men who thought like the British but were treated as Indians. Resistance movements took shape, philosophical debates arose, and new forms of spirituality emerged, blending ancient traditions with Western influences. Gandhi, Tagore, Vivekananda. The names that would define the next century were still whispers, but they were already writing, preaching, organizing. 19th century India was a many-sided mirror. It reflected the power of the crown, but also its fragility. It demonstrated the reach of the empire, but also its limited understanding. While colonial palaces filled with marble and flags, in the villages people continued reciting Sanskrit verses and worshipping gods no missionary could erase. While London spoke of the duty to civilize, in Benares they discussed the purity of the soul and the cycle of time. Victoria, from her desk, carefully wrote words in Urdu. She read diplomatic reports, letters from officials, but also legends, proverbs, and recipes. Her connection to India was intellectual, emotional, aesthetic. She never traveled there, but carried it with her, in lockets, in manuscripts, in fabrics with embroidery invisible to the European eye. In her final years, the presence of India at court was so visible that some began to whisper the queen could no longer fully distinguish between her role as monarch and her personal fascination. But perhaps that was the very essence of empire. A strange mixture of appropriation, admiration, confusion, and longing. India was not just the great colony. It was the shadow that followed the empire to its end. A vast territory that resisted being contained by simple categories, that stared back with equal intensity, that absorbed and transformed everything it touched. For Victoria, it was the deepest echo of her reign. And for the empire, it was the heart that beat outside its body. Among the documents left behind after her death, there were letters written in Hindi, drawings of elephants, hand-translated poems, and carefully preserved portraits of Abdul Karim. They were, in part, the memories of an incomplete relationship, but also the trace of a bond that, although born from power, managed at times to escape the imperial logic. Because sometimes, even within the vast and cold machinery of empire, there are spaces where emotions, gestures, and words create their own parallel story. And while weapons secured the domination of lands, sensibility was sketching another map, subtler, more unstable, but just as real. The hospital and the scalpel. In the damp and shadowy corners of Victorian England, disease was almost a daily presence, a silent ghost that inhabited both the homes of the poor and the perfumed parlors of the aristocracy. No one was truly safe. Health at that time was still a matter caught between superstition, intuition, and desperation. In hospitals, the smell of chloroform had not yet arrived, but the stench of blood, pus, fear, and death soaked the walls down to their deepest foundations. Surgery was an act of controlled violence, and entering an operating room was a sentence that many preferred to avoid. By the middle of the 19th century, British hospitals were more like testing grounds than healing centers. The scalpel still cut without anesthesia, and the hands of surgeons moved quickly, not out of precision, but because the patient's pain had to be shortened as much as possible. Screams were part of the procedure. There were no gloves. There was no asepsis. The coagulated blood from one operation could remain on the table for the next. Many died from infection, tetanus, or gangrene, rather than from the initial wound. Surgeons were seen as educated butchers. Nurses were viewed as voluntary servants. And yet, something had begun to change. Victorian medicine, though still surrounded by shadows, began to slowly awaken from centuries of systematic ignorance. Science, fueled by advances in chemistry, physics, and biology, timidly started knocking on the doors of the hospital. Names like Lister, Simpson, Jenner, and Pasteur began to circulate in medical circles, not merely as theorists, but as true transformers of practice. Anesthesia was one of the first gifts. First came ether, then chloroform, which was partly popularized thanks to Queen Victoria herself, who used it during the birth of one of her children. That changed the perception of pain, and with it, the entire idea of surgery. It became possible to operate without turning the human body into a chamber of torture. One could think, one could observe calmly, one could correct. But if there was one figure who managed to change medicine not from the laboratory, but from the very floor of the hospital, it was Florence Nightingale. Her name has been romanticized so often that the harshness of what she faced is frequently forgotten. Born into a wealthy family, she gave up comfort to pursue a mission few could understand: to turn the care of the sick into a profession, a discipline, a vocation with structure. During the Crimean War, she was sent to a British military hospital and found a hellish scene. Overcrowded corridors, untreated wounds, rats walking among the bodies, soldiers dying not from bullets, but from neglect. And from that chaos, she built order. With statistics in hand and a nearly clinical approach to organization, Nightingale implemented basic standards of hygiene, ventilation, and patient classification. She turned nurses into agents of change, guardians of life. What had previously been considered a menial task, without training or respect, became a cornerstone of the healthcare system. She founded the first modern nursing school and designed hospital management systems that are still studied today. She was a scientist without a lab coat, a reformer without fanfare, an architect of the invisible. Meanwhile, in laboratories and universities, understanding of the human body began to reach an unprecedented level of precision. The germ theory began to replace the old humoral models that still carried medieval legacies. It was finally understood that disease was not a divine punishment, nor an imbalance of fluids, but a biological phenomenon that could be isolated, studied, and, in some cases, prevented. Joseph Lister, influenced by the work of Pasteur, introduced the use of carbolic acid to disinfect wounds and surgical instruments. Post-operative mortality rates plummeted. For the first time, surgery began to be seen as a solution rather than a threat. Crucial steps were also taken in the field of public health. Rapid urbanization had brought with it a proliferation of contagious diseases: cholera, typhus, tuberculosis. Working-class neighborhoods were breeding grounds. Contaminated water, inadequate sewage systems, and overcrowding triggered high infant mortality rates and epidemic outbreaks. But the drive to measure, analyze, and systematize data led to the emergence of the first health censuses, vaccination campaigns, and epidemiological maps. Cities began to be designed with the body in mind. Health was no longer just individual, it was political. And while these advances were undeniable, Victorian medicine still carried profound ethical tensions. The development of more advanced surgical techniques brought a renewed interest in cadavers. Bodies were needed for study, for practice, for dissection. This gave rise to a thriving black market for corpses, where grave robbers became discreet suppliers to medical schools. Fresh bodies were well paid for. The scandal was not small. It even led to the creation of specific laws to regulate the donation and use of human bodies in medical settings. Another point of contention was women's medicine. The female body had for centuries been a domain of myths, prohibitions, and silences. Women were not admitted to medical schools, and if they succeeded in entering, they had to face mockery, contempt, and the systematic denial of their talent. But some, like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Sophia Jex-Blake, broke through those barriers. They studied, graduated, practiced, and they opened doors that others would later walk through. Medicine slowly stopped being an exclusive bastion of bearded men with grave expressions. The treatment of mental disorders also underwent a transformation, though often plagued with errors and horrors. Asylums shifted from being disguised prisons to attempting to become therapeutic institutions, although the change was often more theoretical than real. Neurology began to emerge as a serious discipline, but experiments still included extreme methods, dangerous drugs, and primitive electroshock. Even so, seeds were planted. It began to be whispered, however faintly, that the mind could also fall ill, that the soul was not immune to clinical suffering. Victorian medicine was, in many ways, a frontier territory, between ignorance and science, between tradition and technique, between prejudice and observation. It would still be years before penicillin, decades before modern vaccines, and centuries before a full understanding of the immune system. But the foundations were there. A new way of looking at the human body had been born, not as a mystery to be feared, but as a complex structure that could be known, repaired, and protected. And among the whispers of scalpels, the murmurs of nurses, and the scent of freshly poured chloroform, another revolution was quietly unfolding, more silent, more intimate. Because where once there had been resignation, there was now beginning to be hope. Where once people prayed, now they were diagnosed. Where once people died alone, now there was an attempt to heal, even if imperfectly. The cold wards, the dark operating rooms, the rudimentary stretchers, all these places became stages for a daily struggle against the inevitable. And though death often still won, medicine began to learn its moves, to anticipate its steps, to contest its ground. And it was in that battle, as human as any other, where the Victorian era left one of its deepest marks. The echoes of crime in the fog. London, when night fell, became a different city. The narrow streets of the slums seemed to swallow the sound of footsteps. The fog floated thick like a living substance, and the street lamps barely managed to scratch the most hidden corners with their light. In that dense atmosphere, as dense as a poorly kept secret, silhouettes slid between the shadows with ambiguous intent. Some sought comfort for a few coins. Others simply tried to make it home alive. And a few, the most feared, moved with the coldness of those who knew they could vanish in a breath without leaving a trace. Crime in the Victorian era was not just a social phenomenon. It was part of the urban landscape, an element as familiar as the tram, the chimney, or the top hat. In the most miserable areas of the East End, criminality was almost a survival strategy. There, gangs of orphaned children formed to snatch purses, rob warehouses, forge documents, and traffic bodies. In nameless alleyways, knives were faster than the law, and the bodies found under bridges often disappeared before the inspector had time to take notes. The economic development of the empire had not managed to eradicate marginality. It had only hidden it better. While the center of London gleamed with shop windows, cafes, and opera houses, its edges were infested with poverty, cheap alcohol, and disease. Prostitutes lined the sidewalks like discarded furniture, offering their bodies to those seeking a relief as fleeting as it was dangerous. Venereal diseases were an underground epidemic. The law persecuted them, classified them, locked them up in clinics to reform them, but never managed to contain them. Because the root was not in them, but in the very structure of male desire that needed them and condemned them at the same time. And in the middle of this urban chaos, the first security forces tried to carve out a space. The Metropolitan Police, founded in the year 1829 by Robert Peel, was still viewed with suspicion by many citizens. Their distinctive blue uniform, their round helmets, their stiff posture, contrasted with the flexibility required by street crime. The bobbies were ridiculed in pamphlets, caricatured as useless, and their patrols were as often ineffective as they were necessary. But slowly, through reports, arrests, and above all statistics, they began to professionalize. Archives appeared, observation techniques, systematic interrogations. Modern forensics was still decades away, but the path had already begun to open. Fear did not walk alone. It came accompanied by fascination. Sensationalist press had found the perfect goldmine in urban crimes. Every murder was covered in detail. Every robbery was dramatized. Every execution was narrated as if it were a show. Newspapers sold thousands of copies thanks to macabre stories, and the public, morbidly drawn to evil, devoured tales of blood between breakfast and afternoon tea. The figure of the criminal acquired a new status, that of the modern anti-hero. Characters like Jonathan Wild, the thief and jailer of the previous century, or the grave robbers Burke and Hare, passed into posterity as dark symbols of an era that preferred to stare directly at its own monsters. And then, in the autumn of the year 1888, the fog grew thicker. An unknown killer began murdering women in Whitechapel with surgical precision and brutal violence. His victims were sex workers, poor, invisible. But what made the city tremble was not only the brutality of the crimes, but the impenetrable mystery of their perpetrator. Jack the Ripper, a name assigned by the press through letters of doubtful authorship, became a national shadow. He was never caught, his identity never discovered, and yet his image became embedded in the collective imagination as the embodiment of absolute evil. The media coverage of the case was unprecedented. The entire city seemed to revolve around each new body, each false lead, each note written in red ink. The police were ridiculed for their inefficiency. Forensic doctors clashed over their interpretations. Neighbors organized night patrols. No one slept peacefully. What was disturbing was that the killer seemed to know the city better than anyone, slipping through the cracks of legality without leaving a trace. His violence unrelated to robbery, vengeance, or impulse. It was pure excess, pure destructive drive, something new, something modern. Jack the Ripper was not the first serial killer, but he was the first to inhabit the mind of an entire society as if he were a myth. His figure opened the door to a new way of understanding crime, as a psychological phenomenon, as a sign of the times, as an illness of the urban soul. Theories multiplied. Frustrated doctors, degenerate nobles, immigrants, actors. No one was free from suspicion. Because what Jack embodied was not just a murderer. He was the proof that even in the heart of the empire, evil could live faceless. Meanwhile, literature echoed these dark themes and turned them into immortal stories. Charles Dickens, years earlier, had already described with chilling clarity the city's rotting corners, the street orphans, the professional pickpockets, the corrupt officials. Wilkie Collins inaugurated the detective genre. Conan Doyle brought to life a detective who would use logic as an antidote to chaos. Sherlock Holmes. The crime novel became a mirror, a catharsis, a warning. And in that process, crime ceased to be mere facts. They became symbols. It was no coincidence that murderers attracted so much attention. Because violence was not an anomaly in the Victorian system. It was its exposed nerve. The brutality of child labor, the cruelty of the colonies, the indifference toward poverty, all of that was institutionalized violence. But the street criminal served as a distraction, a channel, a theatrical representation of evil, while structural evils continued operating with British efficiency. By the end of the century, London had become a city that knew how to play with its own fear. It displayed it in newspapers, bound it in novels, discussed it in cafes. But beneath that surface, something deeper was taking shape. The awareness that modernity did not bring only progress and order, but also new forms of chaos, of anonymity, of alienation. The city was no longer just a physical space. It had become a collective mind where each crime left a mark, a scar, a warning. And as the echoes of footsteps faded into the wet cobblestones, through the gaslit mist and the distant barking of dogs, London kept breathing with difficulty. Because crime, like the fog, always found a way to return. The letters that spoke for everyone. Amid the roar of factories, the murmur of alleyways, and the metallic rhythm of the railway, there was another constant heartbeat, more intimate, more persistent, that of words. The letters of the Victorian century did not exist apart from the world around them. They were steeped in soot, walked through the muck of poverty, listened to the muffled cries inside correctional institutions, and breathed in the anguish of orphans. Literature in that era was not a luxury for refined salons. It was, in many cases, the written conscience of a society overwhelmed by its own dilemmas. The rise of literacy, driven by educational reforms, the expansion of the railway, and the decreasing cost of paper, transformed the act of reading into an almost daily habit for a growing portion of the population. Books, once a symbol of privilege, began to fill middle-class homes and, little by little, made their way into working-class households. Serialized novels, sold in weekly installments, were read aloud in taverns, in kitchens, in workshops. It was the first time that fiction reached, with such intensity, millions of people. And the stories that filled those pages were anything but innocent. Charles Dickens was perhaps the most powerful of those chroniclers, a man who knew too well what he described. Abandoned by his father in a debtor's prison and forced to work in a factory as a child, he learned to look at the world with a mix of relentless clarity and fierce compassion. In his novels, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Hard Times, Bleak House, the protagonists were not decorative heroes, but victims of a system that slowly crushed the most vulnerable. His characters walked through real neighborhoods, spoke with the voice of hunger, cried without comfort, and sometimes, only sometimes, found a glimmer of justice. But Dickens did not write merely to stir emotions. His stories were designed to provoke. He exposed religious hypocrisy, bureaucratic absurdity, the brutality of punishment-based education, the cynicism of ostentatious charity. He made the invisible visible, and in every line, in every meticulous description of a cruel official or an abandoned mother, there was a finger pointing at a society that preferred to look the other way. He was a moralist without a sermon, a reformer armed with ink instead of weapons. Beyond the great Dickens, the century was full of voices that did not write to decorate display cases, but to understand the torn soul of their time. The Bronte sisters, secluded in a parsonage in northern England, brought to life novels that explored not only passion, but also confinement, injustice, and psychological violence. Jane Eyre, with her defiant gaze and yearning for freedom, became an unexpected symbol of female independence. Wuthering Heights, with its gothic atmosphere and emotional intensity, blurred the lines between love and obsession, between desire and death. These authors, rejected by publishers and forced to publish under male pseudonyms, broke the molds of feminine literature in their time. Their works did not speak of flowers or dances, but of abandonment, struggle, and the awareness of being trapped in a world built by men. And despite that, or perhaps because of it, they captivated entire generations. George Eliot, pseudonym of Mary Ann Evans, took that rebellion even further. An intellectual, essayist, and translator of German philosophy, she lived publicly with a married man and defied every convention. Her novels, such as Middlemarch or The Mill on the Floss, are populated by complex women, moral dilemmas, and tensions between tradition and change. In her pages, there are no simplistic moral lessons. There is humanity. There is doubt. There is a gaze that digs deep into thought and emotion without ever losing sight of the social context in which each character moves. Thomas Hardy, for his part, embodied disillusionment. His rural England, filled with inevitable tragedies, reflected the failure of progress when it was not accompanied by justice. In novels such as Tess of the D'Urbervilles or Jude the Obscure, misfortune did not come from heaven, but from the system, from prejudice, from inequality. His characters, victims of chance and classism, were not defeated by weakness, but by a society that punished what it could not understand. What is extraordinary about this era is that literature did not only portray what was wrong, it also offered alternative visions, possible worlds, personal utopias. Fantasy and adventure, genres seemingly distant from social criticism, found their space too. Lewis Carroll, with his Alice falling down the rabbit hole, opened a door to absurdity, to dreams, to an inner logic that challenged the rules of the adult world. Oscar Wilde, with his theatrical wit and sharp pen, turned Victorian morality on its head from the most elegant parlors, mocking appearances and celebrating art above any utility. And while novels flourished, newspapers and illustrated magazines provided space for essays, satire, and popular science. The Victorian reader was hungry for knowledge, for opinion, for stories. Reading clubs, literary cafes, and public libraries multiplied that desire. The written word became a vehicle for transformation. Even political speeches and sermons became more literary, more stylized, as if everyone understood that the power of rhetoric had become as strong as that of laws. What unites all these authors, beyond their styles, is the intensity with which they managed to channel the tensions of their time. Because writing in the Victorian age was not a decorative act, it was a way of taking a stand. The blank page became a battlefield where the meaning of humanity, of justice, of possibility was disputed. And so, while steam powered trains and factories, the written word powered consciences. While empires expanded, books challenged their logic. While cities filled with smoke, letters opened windows to new ways of seeing. Literature was the constant whisper that accompanied every transformation, every sorrow, every hope. It did not shout, but it remained. It infiltrated. It multiplied. And in that deep murmur, that underground current of ideas, emotions, and revelations, a new sensitivity began to take shape, a different way of understanding the world and oneself. Because the greatest changes, sometimes, begin with a single well-written sentence: the world under the microscope. In the best-lit corners of the Victorian era, where soot could not reach the windows and the noise of machines was only a distant murmur, a new kind of exploration began to emerge. Not toward distant lands or continents to conquer, but toward the invisible, the microscopic, what for centuries had remained beyond the reach of human eyes and imagination. It was a journey inward, toward the very heart of matter, toward the mystery of life, and what was discovered there had nothing to envy of colonial epics or military feats. In many ways, it was more unsettling, deeper, more irreversible. The 19th century was, without a doubt, the time when science became a new kind of authority. It did not replace religion, but it began to coexist with it in an uneasy relationship of mutual suspicion and silent dependence. For while churches spoke of the soul, laboratories spoke of organs, tissues, atoms. While sermons explained morality, naturalists classified species and reconstructed genealogies that followed not a divine design, but a colder, older, more indifferent logic. In that context, the figure of Charles Darwin shone with an intensity that still resonates. Educated at Cambridge, fond of geology and biology, embarked on a scientific expedition that would change his destiny and that of Western thought. Darwin did not set out to destroy the foundations of faith, but he shook them like no one else. The theory of evolution by natural selection, meticulously presented in his work on the origin of species, published in the year 1859, offered a radical vision of the world. We were not created as we are, but we descend, slowly, from earlier life forms, and our existence is the result of adaptations, errors, and mutations. The idea was as powerful as it was disturbing. Suddenly, the Victorian man was no longer the pinnacle of creation, but just another link in a chain with no apparent plan. Natural history ceased to be a sequence of marvels and became a story of survival, competition, and transformation. And although many tried to discredit Darwin or to domesticate his ideas, the impact was irreversible. A rift opened between the traditional narrative of the world and empirical evidence, a rift that would only grow in the decades to come. But the Victorian scientific revolution was not limited to biology. In the basements of hospitals, in the halls of universities, in the workshops of solitary inventors, breakthroughs were occurring that would transform daily life in ways that were impossible to anticipate at the time. Michael Faraday, for example, without any formal academic training, discovered fundamental principles of electricity and electromagnetism. His experiments with coils, magnetic fields, and induced currents laid the groundwork for technologies we now consider basic, from the electric generator to the motor that powers transportation. James Clerk Maxwell went even further, developing the equations that describe how electricity and magnetism are manifestations of a single phenomenon. These ideas, formulated with astonishing mathematical rigor, explained how light, that seemingly intangible phenomenon, was in fact an electromagnetic wave. Suddenly, seeing ceased to be a mystery and became a vibration with frequency and speed. In hospitals, medicine was undergoing its own process of illumination. Where once there had been pain, improvisation, and superstition, systematic observation, asepsis, and statistics were beginning to take hold. The introduction of anesthesia forever changed the experience of surgery. Ether and chloroform allowed patients to be operated on without screams, without struggling, without nightmare memories. Florence Nightingale, for her part, turned the art of caring for the sick into a rigorous discipline based on data, ventilation, hygiene, and organized compassion. Her work during the Crimean War not only saved lives, it reformed the British healthcare system and granted new dignity to nursing. Microscopes became more powerful, more precise. Bacteria, cells, and damaged tissues were observed. Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister forever changed the relationship between humanity and disease. The former demonstrated that microorganisms could cause infections. The latter applied that idea in operating rooms, developing antiseptic practices that dramatically reduced surgical mortality. What was once invisible and lethal could now be fought with logic, discipline, and surgical precision. Meanwhile, the study of time and space was becoming more sophisticated. Geology, with figures like Charles Lyell, dismantled the idea of a young Earth. Fossils spoke of creatures extinct for millions of years. Layers of soil were like pages in a gigantic book narrating an immeasurable story, in which human presence was barely a recent epilogue. Time became deep, dizzying, and alien to the human scale. Even astronomy, from the telescopes of Greenwich, reminded us that the world did not revolve around us. New planets were identified, eclipses were calculated with precision, comet trajectories were predicted. The regularity of the universe, far from comforting, intensified the sense of smallness. For the more the cosmos was understood, the more our fragility became evident. And yet, with each discovery, with each new formula, something else emerged. A renewed sense of wonder. The Victorian century was a time of fear, yes, but also of enthusiasm. The kind of enthusiasm born when the impossible begins to take shape, when the invisible is revealed and the intangible can be measured. The scientists of that time were not gods, but neither were they mere observers. They were interpreters of a score that was still being written. Knowledge, far from being cold or distant, became a force capable of transforming the world. There was no institution, factory, home, or war untouched by its consequences. Science became a tool, an argument, a foundational myth. And although many did not understand its details, they sensed its power. That is why it was feared, revered, and debated. In museum display cases, in illustrated treatises, in public lectures, knowledge was being democratized. It was not just for scholars. It was for anyone with curiosity, with a hunger for explanation, with a desire to understand the world they lived in. And so, without fanfare, without armies, without banners, one of the great revolutions in human history was fought. The revolution of ideas. One that needed no cannons, because a microscope, an oil lamp, and a mind willing to look beyond the obvious were enough. The crystal that reflected an empire. On a mild May morning in 1851, as spring had just begun to creep through the parks and rooftops of London, an orderly but impatient crowd began to gather in Hyde Park. Men in top hats, women in wide hoop skirts, and children dressed with almost military decorum moved about in carriages, trams, even on foot, guided by a mixture of rumor and anticipation. They were all heading toward a building unlike anything they had ever seen before. A palace made of neither stone, nor wood, nor brick. A building as transparent as air, appearing to float among the trees. They called it the Crystal Palace. Thus began the Great Exhibition of 1851, an event that was not just another fair, nor a simple display of products. It was the inaugural act of a new kind of global spectacle, the World's Fair. But it was also, at its core, a declaration of principles. There it stood, in the heart of the capital's most elegant park, the crystallization, both literal and symbolic, of the world the Victorians were building. A world of steel, of precision, of commerce, of order. A world that believed itself capable of encompassing everything, classifying everything, explaining everything. The building, designed by Joseph Paxton, was an engineering marvel. Inspired by the greenhouses and modular structures Paxton knew well, it was erected in just 9 months without nails or mortar, assembled like a giant puzzle of glass and cast iron. Its transparent walls allowed daylight to flood every corner, eliminating the need for lamps or candles. It was over 500 meters long and more than 30 meters tall. Inside, an entire forest could fit. Literally, whole trees were preserved beneath its structure, but beyond its appearance, what it housed was even more ambitious. More than 30 nations were represented, with over 100,000 objects on display. Sewing machines, locomotives, telescopes, fabrics, porcelain, weapons, jewelry, furniture, clocks, exotic goods. It was a catalog of human ingenuity, a taxonomy of industrial and artisanal progress, a stage set for the planet's productive power. And at the center of it all, as host, Great Britain. Not as just another country, but as arbiter and model. The idea had come from Prince Albert, consort to Queen Victoria, who saw in science and industry not only tools for prosperity, but paths toward peace. His vision was internationalist, modernizing, almost utopian, and in part, he achieved his goal. For more than 5 months, the Crystal Palace was visited by over 6 million people, at a time when the total population of the United Kingdom barely exceeded 20 million. Special discounted tickets were available for workers. Excursions were organized from every region. Guidebooks, souvenirs, prints were sold. And those who attended never forgot what they had seen. For the average visitor, the exhibition was an overwhelming experience. There were the latest advances of the Industrial Revolution, steam engines operating before their eyes, automatic printing presses, precision instruments. But there were also oddities that provoked both fascination and bewilderment. Traditional garments from distant countries, spices whose aromas seemed to come from another planet, jewels from colonies where imperial subjects lived in precarious conditions while their riches glittered behind pristine glass. Because if this showcase of wonders revealed anything, albeit unintentionally, it was imbalance. Progress had a price, and that price was paid in mines, in factories, in colonial fields. The India displays, for example, were full of rich ornaments and textiles, but there was no trace of the peasant who had produced them. The African cases showed ivory, gold, exotic woods, but not the chained bodies that, in previous decades, had been part of the slave trade. The exhibition, then, was a mirror. It reflected glory, but also shadows. It displayed talent, but hid the sweat. It was, in many ways, the shop window of an empire that knew how to organize, to exhibit, to control. And although its narrative spoke of global harmony and friendly competition between nations, the truth was that Britain had built the stage, written the script, and reserved for itself the starring role. Even so, for most attendees, that spectacle was not a cause for criticism, but for wonder. The 19th century was in love with its own reflection. The machine was beautiful, numbers were law, and glass was a symbol of purity. The exhibition offered an experience of order. Everything in its place, each culture on its shelf, every nation reduced to its most eye-catching products. It was not a natural history museum, but it shared the logic of the curiosity cabinet: gather, name, display. And in doing so, it taught the visitor a particular way of seeing the world, as something that could be measured, catalogued, possessed. But the most impressive thing was not what happened inside the Crystal Palace, but what came afterward. With the funds raised, key institutions were financed: the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum. The South Kensington district was transformed into a zone dedicated to knowledge. The seed planted by Prince Albert grew, literally, in the form of museums, academies, archives. The ephemeral had become permanent. The structure itself was dismantled and moved to Sydenham Hill, where it continued to serve as a cultural and entertainment center until its destruction by fire in 1936. But its legacy remained. Since then, every great world exposition has carried, to some degree, its DNA. Every international fair, every national pavilion decorated to excess, every gallery that blends art, science, and commerce owes something to that first experiment in 1851. And perhaps that is why, because it was a founding act, the Great Exhibition holds such a special place in Victorian history, because it condensed in a single space all the contradictions of the time: the faith in progress and the blindness to inequality, the openness to the world and the will to dominate it, the art of manufacture and the forgetting of the human body behind the machine. Nothing symbolized Victorian modernity as clearly as that transparent building. Nothing revealed so clearly the limits of that transparency. Because glass, though clean, does not always allow us to see what lies behind. The silence Albert left behind. When the calendar marked the 14th of December of 1861, London did not stop. The trains kept roaring through the stations, the factories maintained their furnaces lit, and the newspapers announced in their usual rhetoric the death of a man who, for many, was no more than the husband of the Queen. But in the halls of Windsor Castle, time seemed to crack. Prince Albert had died, and with him, more than just a life had extinguished. The emotional and symbolic center of Queen Victoria's reign had vanished. The man who had been the silent compass of an empire left behind a void that would never be filled. From that day forward, silence became a constant presence. It was not the usual absence that comes with the death of a loved one, but a denser kind of silence, almost tangible, as if the very atmosphere had changed its weight. Victoria, devastated, entered a mourning that would have no end. It was not a symbolic retreat or a reserved gesture of sadness. It was a total transformation. The Queen, still young, still at the height of her power, chose never to be the same again. Albert had been her everything. From the moment she met him, when they were both still teenagers burdened with responsibilities imposed by lineage, to the consolidation of a deeply united couple bound by trust, admiration, and a routine as affectionate as it was intellectual, their bond was extraordinary. He did not simply accompany her. He took part in state affairs, reorganized court life, and protected the monarchy's image with almost obsessive precision. He was her private editor, her political advisor, the architect of her public image. And in the corners where no one looked, he was her companion, the reader at her side, the present father, the man who slept on the other half of the bed. Albert's death was not unexpected, but it was unacceptable. He had been silently deteriorating physically for years. Excessive work, constant worries, tensions with his older children, and relentless vigilance over the royal family's reputation had worn down his health. A misdiagnosed intestinal infection, probably stomach cancer or typhoid fever, ended his life in less than a month. Victoria, who had only been informed of the seriousness in the final days, found no comfort. not even in medical certainty. To her, the world had collapsed. From then on, the Queen transformed her grief into a kind of emotional policy. She withdrew from public life for years, wore mourning attire for the rest of her life, ordered mirrors to be covered, portraits of herself to be removed, and in every residence a vacant chair was placed across from her own in memory of the prince. The rituals were unbreakable. Albert's clothes had to be laid out each morning, his razor placed on the dressing table, his water jug changed every night. It was as if, by keeping the customs intact, she could deny the absence, or at least negotiate with it. The nation at times grew impatient. The absent queen sparked murmurs, caricatures, open criticism. Could a monarch immerse herself in such personal grief without affecting the rhythm of the state? But she would not yield. The pain was immovable, and with it, her image changed forever. From the young, lively queen portrayed in gardens and accompanied by her husband, she became the hieratic figure, with a severe face, dressed in black, who would become the very symbol of the Victorian era. Mourning, unintentionally, became state policy. The effect on her children was equally lasting. Edward, the heir, who had already been a source of tension for Albert due to his frivolous behavior, became the target of his mother's silent contempt. She saw him, in some way, as an indirect culprit in her husband's death, convinced that the distress caused by his conduct had hastened the outcome. The relationship between mother and son cooled for decades, and the weight of the paternal memory followed him all the way to his own coronation, long afterward. But beyond the intimate tragedy, Albert's death marked a turning point in the course of the century itself. Until then, his presence had ensured a balance between modernity and tradition, between symbolic monarchy and active monarchy. He had been a tireless defender of science, art, education, and social reform. His vision, though discreet, had pushed Victoria toward more progressive, more open decisions. With his death, that momentum slowed. The Queen became more conservative, more dependent on external figures who fed her isolation. The most peculiar of these companions was John Brown, a Scottish servant who became Victoria's intimate confidant. His constant presence, his rough but sincere manners, and his unquestionable devotion stirred rumors, criticism, and scandals. Although there was never any proof of a romantic or inappropriate relationship, the closeness between them puzzled the court and the public. Years later, something similar would happen with the Indian servant Abdul Karim, demonstrating how, in Albert's absence, the Queen sought human refuge beyond protocol, far from political noise. It is tempting to think that Victoria's mourning was merely an act of love amplified by power. But it was more than that. It was a way of building legacy. By keeping Albert's memory alive for half a century, the Queen simultaneously forged a narrative of greatness and sacrifice. She turned pain into a public virtue, memory into a state act, and her own withdrawal into a peculiar way of exercising power. Because although she stepped back, she never abdicated. She ruled from the shadows, through letters, emissaries, and a spectral presence that, the more distant it became, the more respect it commanded. With the years, the deceased prince was elevated to an almost sacred figure. Statues were erected, his speeches edited, and a mausoleum built that resembled a temple more than a tomb. The Albert Memorial, in front of the Royal Albert Hall in London, was not just a tribute. It was a cathedral of remembrance. A way to remind the world that behind the Queen had existed a man who did not rule, but who influenced more than many ministers. A man whose silent death managed to alter the emotional temperature of an entire empire. And so, as the years piled upon Victoria's shoulders, her figure became inseparable from the absence that defined her. In every portrait, every ceremony, every decree signed in her private chambers, there was the shadow of the one who was no longer there. The century advanced. Wars changed shape. Cities grew. factories multiplied. But at the heart of the British Crown, time seemed to have frozen in December of 1861. And although the world did not stop, something did break. Something deep, something subtle, something that neither progress nor protocol could repair. And in that echo of emptiness, in that persistence of mourning, the twilight tone began to emerge with which the end of an era would slowly approach. The last echoes of the longest century. When people speak of the Victorian era, they usually summon the image of a solid queen, of a perfectly oiled imperial machine, of a world marching steadily toward progress. But the final decade of Queen Victoria's reign was, in truth, a time marked by tremors. Not the kind that shake buildings, but the ones that unsettle ideas, certainties, and habits. What had begun with steam, caution, and solemnity was approaching its end amid changes as subtle as they were irreversible. At the heart of that change beat an uncomfortable truth. The century was no longer young, neither was the Queen. Victoria, that young girl who had ascended the throne without having slept the night before, was now an old, almost immobile woman ruling from memory. But around her, the world roared differently. Cities were larger, machines faster, workers more organized. The words strike, union, and rights were no longer whispered. They had become slogans on banners. The idea that the natural order was eternal had begun to crack. Class differences, once seen as inevitable, were now being debated in newspapers, in taverns, and in intellectual clubs. Poverty was no longer considered solely the result of sin or laziness. Social science, still in its infancy, began to shine light into the darkest corners of the industrial system. Statistics became weapons. Reports, evidence. The state could no longer look the other way. Meanwhile, women were beginning to raise their voices with an urgency that unsettled even the most enlightened. The suffragists were not asking. They were demanding. It was no longer enough to praise the idealized image of the virtuous mother or offer poetic tributes to femininity. They wanted to vote, to become doctors, to hold public office. They wanted to be treated as citizens, not as ornaments of the household. The Queen, paradoxically, was both a woman and the supreme authority, yet she did not support these demands. Her concept of feminine duty remained anchored in the teachings of the previous century, and yet it was inevitable. Women were stepping onto the stage with the force of those who had waited too long for their turn. The empire, for its part, was not resting. It continued to grow and expand, but also began to show cracks. The Boer War in South Africa began in the year 1899 and revealed to the world that British power was not as invulnerable as it seemed. Poorly prepared troops, unexpected resistance, a divided public opinion. The brutality of the conflict, the conditions in the civilian concentration camps, the sluggishness of military progress, all of this undermined the polished image of a morally superior power. The cost of dominion was beginning to show not only in distant lands but also in national pride. Victoria's children, by then already adults, were taking positions on the international stage. They were kings, princesses, and diplomats spread across Europe. But their influence was no longer a guarantee of stability. Alliances between monarchies, once a functioning political network, began to resemble old cobwebs in the face of rising nationalism. In the cafes of Vienna, on the barricades of Paris, in the parliaments of Berlin, the idea of nation was debated with a passion that made crowns start to weigh heavily. The aristocracy was no longer the center of the world. The crowd was. Amid all this, the Queen continued writing in her journals, reviewing reports, staying active, but at a different pace. Every public appearance was an event. Her figure, wrapped in perpetual mourning, had become almost sacred. The British people revered her not for her power, but for what she represented: continuity, steadfastness, identity. She had outlived nearly all her ministers, outlasted map changes, and witnessed the transition from sails to gas and from gas to electricity. She was a constant in a world that no longer was. And so, in the final years of the 19th century, the Victorian era began to resemble a time capsule, an era still present, but no longer setting the pace. New generations were looking toward other horizons. At universities, students spoke of Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx. Religion was no longer enough to explain the soul. Science was no longer just progress. It had become a threat as well. The idea of the future, so clear at the Universal Exposition of the year 1851, now felt like uncertain ground. Artists, for their part, began to break free from the moral corset that had defined much of the century. Realism gave way to symbolism, then to modernism. Paintings filled with distorted bodies, artificial lights, and nocturnal cities. Literature abandoned the moralizing tone to explore doubt, desire, and absurdity. It was the beginning of the end for an aesthetic based on duty, and the birth of another, more subjective, more ambiguous. All this was happening while the Queen remained firm on her throne. But history, the kind that does not ask permission, was already elsewhere. The Victorian machine had been mighty, but it was beginning to age. Its oil was protocol, its gears, custom, and its fuel, the figure of a sovereign who, though admirable, belonged to another world. It was clear that the century could not stretch any further. The world had changed too much, and those living in it knew it, even if they could not always put it into words. The air felt different. The questions had changed. The answers were more elusive. It was no longer enough to look toward London. The voices of the world were many and louder. And in that crossroads, where the past still wore its finery but the future pressed forward impatiently, there was an atmosphere of threshold, as if everyone knew, without saying it, that they were witnessing the final bars of a symphony that had defined an age. The end was near, very near. The clock of the century was about to strike its final hour, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The Queen, whom everyone mourned. Dawn broke on the 22nd of January of the year 1901, when the final breath of a woman who no longer truly belonged to this world escaped into the stillness of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Queen Victoria had died. The woman, the mother, the eternal widow had passed away. The figure who had defined an era, whose name had merged with the century itself, was gone. With her, a curtain fell, one that had hung for over 60 years, casting a shadow that had hidden the changing faces of time. And that day, as rarely happens in history, the entire world stopped in its tracks. Victoria had been many things, but above all, she had been constancy. Her reign, the longest in British history up to that point, had witnessed the transformation of a rural nation into an industrial power, the rise of the railway, the spread of the telegraph, and the invention of cinema. She had seen 6 prime ministers come and go, had buried her husband, 3 of her children, countless friends, and still she remained. Not on a golden throne, but in a wheelchair, dressed in black, her gaze fixed on a horizon that only she could still comprehend. Her body was small, fragile, but the symbolic weight she carried was immense, almost unbearable. Her health had declined slowly but visibly in her final years. Vision problems, rheumatic pains, mental exhaustion. She could barely write, barely speak. She communicated through gestures, dictated notes, silences. Power had passed almost entirely into the hands of her advisors and heirs, but no one dared speak of succession out loud. Her mere presence, though weakened, remained a barrier against chaos. She was the living memory of order, and the day she died, that order seemed to tremble. The announcement was brief and solemn. At 6:30 in the evening, the palace reported that Her Majesty had passed peacefully, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Among them, the future Edward VII and her most famous grandson, the young Wilhelm, Kaiser of Germany. The entire genealogical tree of Europe seemed to have gathered around her deathbed. That royal family, whose ties wove together thrones, wars, and alliances, now shared a final moment of intimacy. The woman who had been the wife of Prince Albert, mother to 9 children, and grandmother to more than 40 grandchildren, left behind a legacy that could not be measured in titles or medals. Bells began to toll in London, in Edinburgh, in Dublin, not in celebration, but in mourning. In train stations, people stopped to read the official notices with expressions hard to define, a mix of sadness, respect, and vertigo. Because although many knew the Queen was aged, her death somehow seemed unreal. She had been there for so long, so embedded in daily life, that imagining the country without her was like trying to walk without a shadow. Newspapers rushed to print the news. Shops lowered their shutters. Theaters closed their curtains. The funeral was organized with impeccable precision. Victoria had left clear instructions. No fully black dresses, no excessively gloomy rituals. She wanted a military burial, simple but dignified, with flags, with flowers, with honor. She wanted to be buried next to Albert, in the mausoleum at Frogmore, where the remains of the only man she had ever loved rested. She wished to be remembered without theatrical tears or hollow solemnities. But the magnitude of her legacy made discretion impossible. When the funeral procession finally departed, it looked like a scene lifted from a painting. The white carriage, drawn by horses and flanked by soldiers from every corner of the empire, crossed a silent nation. The crowd did not shout or applaud. They only watched. It was as if each citizen felt they were witnessing something that would never happen again. From windows, from balconies, from fields, men and women of all social classes paid tribute to a figure who, whether they liked it or not, had marked their lives. In India, ceremonies were held in honor of the Empress. In Canada, Australia, and South Africa, flags were flown at half-mast. In the most remote corners of the globe, where British influence had reached, machines stopped, activities were suspended. Not by decree, but by instinct. It was the end of an era, and everyone knew it. Even those who had never seen her felt it. Because Victoria was not just a monarch, she was the face of a way of life, of a mode of thought, of a vision of time. In her will, in addition to logistical and administrative matters, she left personal items to each of her children and grandchildren. Mementos, photographs, brooches, letters. She wanted her memory not to be lost among cold marble, but to live on in the hands of those who had shared her world. Her granddaughter Beatrice, her closest confidant, was given the task of editing her diaries. Thousands of handwritten pages recounting not only matters of state but also intimate thoughts, passions, fears, and small scenes of domestic life. That archive, more than any statue, held Victoria's true voice. And in the days following her death, the country began to face an uncomfortable question: what came next? The 20th century had begun. The new king, Edward VII, was a man of different tastes, more worldly, less austere. The court would change, priorities too. Politics, culture, international relations, everything was at stake. But for the moment, no one wanted to think about that. The mourning, both real and symbolic, had to be fulfilled first. Because the world was not mourning just a queen. It was mourning a time that would not return. A stability that, in retrospect, had been more fragile than it seemed. An illusion of permanence that had lasted too long. And in that silent collective grieving, the final tribute was woven. Not with pompous words, not with empty parades, but with the intimate recognition that from that moment on, everything would be different. The new century had already begun. But the echo of the Queen still resonated in the streets, in the customs, in the way the British people saw themselves. History moved forward as always. But that figure, so old and yet so present, continued watching from portraits, from coins, from the persistent memory. And as the first light of the new century pushed through the fog of uncertainty, one thing remained clear. Victoria had not entirely gone. The Victorian spirit that still lives within us. 100 years may seem like an eternity when we look back, but there are eras that refuse to rest completely, that persist beyond calendars, that cross generations without asking for permission. The Victorian era is one of them. The Queen died, the candles of the 19th century went out, the machines evolved, and war shook everything. But if one observes with the attention of someone listening to a whisper amid the noise, one can still perceive the steady pulse of that time in our everyday lives. It is in the cities, in the lines of buildings we still consider classic, in public parks, in the wrought iron benches that survive on the corners of London, of Liverpool, of Glasgow. Urban planning as we know it, with sidewalks, stations, lampposts, working-class neighborhoods, and residential zones, is not a modern invention, but a creature born and raised in that century of smoke and expansion. Victorian houses, with their sloped roofs and brick chimneys, are much more than an aesthetic. They are a way of inhabiting the world that still resists the passage of time. It is also in the words, in how we refer to duty, to decency, to work. In expressions like professional ethics, private life, table manners. The moral framework that solidified under Queen Victoria's reign continues to influence our perception of right and wrong, even if we do not always recognize it. And although many of those norms have, over time, been challenged, redefined, or even dismantled, they left deep marks. The respect for privacy, the idea of home as an emotional refuge, the value assigned to family as a structural core, all of that has roots in that century, so apparently rigid, and yet so transformative. It is in science, in laboratories and hospitals, in the way we conceive of progress. Because it was in the Victorian era that this modern faith was established, at times naive, at times dangerous, that knowledge can redeem us, that every problem has a technical solution. Darwin, Faraday, Nightingale, Lister. Names that not only changed their time but shaped ours. Contemporary medicine, for example, would not exist as we know it without the hygienist revolution that began in the poorly ventilated corridors of Victorian hospitals. It is also in politics, in parliamentarianism, in state bureaucracy, in the slow but unstoppable path toward the expansion of civil rights. The debates over suffrage, over public education, over the redistribution of wealth and labor conditions that filled the speeches of 19th century legislators still echo today, though with different names and protagonists. Many of our current structures are direct heirs of those ideological foundations. Even entertainment carries Victorian legacies. The serialized novel, the detective story, Gothic fiction. The way we consume fiction, by episodes in accessible formats with memorable characters who evolve, was a literary invention of that century, one that adapted with ease to cinema, to television, to modern platforms. Sherlock Holmes, The Monster of Frankenstein, Ebenezer Scrooge, Jane Eyre. They are not ghosts from the past. They are active cultural presences, voices that still speak to us. But perhaps the most complex legacy of that time lies in the way we relate to power. The Victorian era witnessed an unprecedented expansion of the British Empire, which carried its flag, its language, and its economic model to every corner of the planet. That colonial impulse, which for decades was justified by arguments of civilization and moral duty, left scars that are still visible in contemporary global dynamics. The borders drawn, the ethnic conflicts, the structural inequalities. All of that connects to decisions made in London offices during the height of the Victorian age. And yet, to judge that legacy through modern eyes requires nuance. Because amid the injustices, there were also advancements. Amid the oppression, resistance emerged. Amid the solemnity, irony was born. The Victorian spirit is not a monolithic block of outdated values, but a contradictory web where repression and ingenuity coexist, rigidity and wonder, the darkness of alleys and the clarity of ideas just beginning to germinate. Today, when we switch on an electric lamp, when we travel by train, when we check a work schedule or demand public education, we are engaging in a dialogue with that time. We do so without realizing it, like someone breathing without thinking about the air. But each of those gestures has a story. And many of those stories began to be written in the long shadow of Victoria. Perhaps that is why, when we see her portrait on a banknote, when we read her name on a plaque or a station, we feel something that goes beyond nostalgia. We feel that despite the time past, we have not entirely escaped her orbit. The 21st century has its own rules, its own fears, its own lights, but something in its emotional architecture remains profoundly Victorian. Because some eras stay, they live within us. They whisper to us from the past, not to dictate what we must do, but to remind us who we have been. And so, in the midst of contemporary speed, of screens, of algorithms, of constant uncertainty, it is worth pausing for a moment and listening to that whisper, listening to the echo of a tiny woman who, with her imposing presence, shaped an age. Listening to the murmur of a society that wanted to encompass everything and, in the attempt, mapped out our deepest contradictions. The Victorian era is over. Its queen rests. Its streets, its voices, its letters have been lost in the dust of time. But if you pay close attention, very near to you, there is a word, a custom, a way of seeing the world that still belongs to her. If you have made it this far, thank you for joining us on this long journey. If you enjoyed this narration, I invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments, share your impressions, or simply say hello. It is always a pleasure to read you. Subscribe to the channel if you would like to continue exploring other stories that still sleep beneath the surface of time. Good night.